Okay, this is the last note group in our Old Testament survey. We're looking at the Psalms, but in in a greater sense, today we will mainly focus on Hebrew poetry because it's unique, it's different than English poetry. Uh, and I will say for a lot of my life, I did not have a ton of use for the poetry in the Bible. And you know it's poetry if it is indented and the line does not go all the way across and then there's a space between each line. Uh, that means that either it's a poem in the original language or it's a quotation from somewhere else in the Bible, that it's structured like that. But for a lot of my life, I did not have much use for poetry uh, in the Bible, the Psalms, and so forth. I think I had a prejudice because I did not consider poetry to be very masculine. I'm not sure. But when I was in my doctoral work, I had to take a class, a seminar on Hebrew poetry in the Psalms, and I was astonished about the things that I am going to share with you today about the way it's structured. And I was able to see so much more in each line once I knew these things. So today might be a little bit more like a classroom lecture than we're used to. I hope it's informative to you and helps you understand the Hebrew poetry better. So our book card, this is our final book card. I believe if you were writing down the book card information, a lot of times my students will do it on index cards so that at the end of the class they will have 39 cards so they can flip through and find, the book that they want. That number 19 that you see there is all these numbers on the book cards go with if you open up an English Bible and look at the table of contents, that is the order of the English canon, the English Bible for the Old Testament books. So out of 39, Psalms is right in the middle. It's book 19. Now I changed the order around that I am presenting it, and the reason for that was in the class, when I first did the class, had prophets last, doing the prophets, and I was not ever able to get through all the prophets. So I switched them to section 4 and then did the poems and the poetry last. That wouldn't have been a problem with us here because we're not time constrained, but anyway, it was book 19 in the table of contents. So Psalms is a Latin word that basically means songs. And so the purpose of the Psalms or the songs is to communicate with God and worship Him. It is a collection of 150 poems that have been put together, and I think there's a structure. We will look when we look at the Psalms proper. We'll look at that structure. It is traditionally divided into 5 books, and so I believe it is somewhere in the Bible, but it may not be, where they refer to the 5 books of Moses, the Pentateuch, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and the 5 books of David. And that would be the breakup, the division of the book of Psalms. I think book 1 would be Psalm 1 through Psalm 41, and I believe book 2 is Psalm 42 through Psalm 72, to give you an idea. Anyway. But these are songs written to God. Poets, the writers of these poems, communicating with God and giving Him worship. I always say it, but worship just means value. Making God valuable, expressing God's value, practicing God's value. And it's the truth about the Christian faith. We are not a works-based faith. We are a faith-based faith. That sometimes, and I think this is true of all religions, it's maybe the downfall of all religions, is that it is awful easy to take God for granted. As you try to live the Christian life, maybe God becomes an afterthought. We don't think about him as much as we should. And it is sometimes difficult to love a spirit. It's much easier to love people, I think. And so it is very important to have a book which expresses God's value and a love for God. And as we read it, I think really, I say read the Psalms, you really should pray through the Psalms, that as you read the words, you are praying them to God in a lot of places to really truly find the purpose in them. When you try to read them like information, like you might the book of Genesis to get information on Abraham, I don't think they do much. Rather, it would be a little bit awkward to read Genesis as a prayer because it's telling a story. But you should always read the Psalms as a prayer, I think. We're going to look at these key Psalms. It's hard when you have 150 chapters to pick out key texts, but those are the key texts. We'll look at those, if not today, next time. The one-sentence summary of the book of Psalms, God, the true and glorious King, and I'll just make a note on that. One of the keys to understanding the perspective of the biblical authors is to understand that they see God as the King of the universe. And it's important to understand that in the ancient time, the role of a king. And so there are times, for example, in the book of Psalms where God, his qualities as a warrior is sung about quite a bit. And some people today find that odd. But in the ancient world, it was the king's job to protect the people, to keep the people calm, to make sure that the grocery stores have groceries in it, that the trash is taken away. We call that order, to keep order in the kingdom. And so a lot of things are projected on God because the overarching truth is that they thought of him as the king of the universe. And that the human kings that existed were vassals of the divine king, that they worked for God. And so if a human king is doing badly, he is being rebellious against the big king, God of the universe. I still think that is true, and I think most of them are naughty now. Most of the kings are naughty. Anyway, God, the true and glorious King, is worthy of all praise and prayer. What that means is we are not doing God a favor by praising him. We are doing what we should do. We're doing our duty as created beings to worship the Creator and to praise him. God is not needy. God is not a beggar begging us to like him. But he is the true and glorious King who is worthy of any praise, any prayer that we lift up. Any thanksgiving and confidence. And so this is going through naming the different types, as we'll see later, the different kinds of psalms that you see. Whatever occasion in the personal and community life, there are psalms that will be helpful in making God the top of our worship. So, for example, Psalm 27, verse 1, and you can see that I have diagrammed this, and that we'll talk about the parallelism as we talk about Hebrew poetry today, but this is just a good example of a psalm. Yahweh is my light and my salvation. And since that is true, the second half of that line is, whom shall I fear? If I value what God thinks the most, that is going to make all the other things that I worry about pale in comparison. Yahweh is the stronghold of my life. of whom shall I be afraid? We need to pray that every day. That is, boy, that really cuts to the quick of living life in a broken world. We live in fear of this and that. And worship of God as the light. When you fear darkness, God should be your light. When you fear getting lost in the struggles of life, God is your salvation. When you fear things overwhelming you, overrunning you, God is the stronghold. And if you view God that way as sovereign, and He is the stronghold, the light, and the salvation, then if the bad things you fear happen, whose will is it? It's God's will. Or that is, let me tread carefully. God does not want us bad things to happen to us, but there are times in God's will that bad things happen. You know, God is ultimately, if you believe God is sovereign, ultimately God is the source of all things. And so it is a frame of mind. You see there the importance of a frame of mind. We do not want bad things to happen for us. We ask God for them not. But we understand that when they happen, that God is still in control, and that in His will, this bad things have come our way. So we don't fear them. We receive it as God's will. All right, so let's talk about Hebrew poetry. Let me give you a definition. Hebrew poetry, HP, is a type of literature that communicates with terse lines that are usually similar in length. Now, terse there does not mean negative. I always thought that the word terse meant negative. Terse just means short lines. We in our common speech, we take on terse to be negative because usually when somebody answers with a short answer, they're angry. But terse means short little lines employing parallelism and in imagery in high frequency. So those are three big time characteristics of the Hebrew poetry. Short little statements. We don't get a ton of information. They are parallel, as you see from Psalm 27:1, the parallelism in the different elements of the phrases. And they employ imagery there. Even in that little verse, light versus darkness, stronghold versus vulnerability. So darkness makes us fearful, but God is light. Stronghold, being vulnerable makes us fearful, but God is a stronghold. So parallelism and imagery. Now, English poetry, we go by rhyme, and meter. There's a rhythm, a definite rhythm in English poetry. Roses are red, violets are blue. Don't date a girl who smoke, drinks, and chew. And that's a rhythm there. The meter is da 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 da. Haiku has a meter. Da da da. I can't do a haiku right off the top. If I thought a little bit, I could. And then rhyme is a big function in English poetry, but not in Hebrew. Not necessarily features at all. Many of the Psalms, you'll see no rhyme. It's very rare, actually, in Hebrew poetry. And they're not worried about that rhythm, the meter of it. It is interesting. There are some Psalms that I do think try to pick Hebrew words that create an auditory effect. The words sound like, there are some words in Psalm 29 where they're talking about thunder that kind of sound like thunder striking, but that's a different study. All right, so the line, the basic unit, a line can be viewed as the basic unit of Hebrew poetry. So what is a line? Well, be careful, don't confuse that a line with a sentence, because it's possible for one line in Hebrew poetry to have more than one sentence in that. Let me show you a line here. This is one line in two sections. And I'll tell you in a minute, those sections are each called a colon. So Psalm 117:1, praise Yahweh, all you nations, extol him, all you peoples. Those two parts of this, two complete sentences, are one line in Hebrew. Often, as we just saw in Psalm 117, a Hebrew line is made up of two halves. Each half line is called a colon, a C-O-L-O-N, colon. So, in Psalm 92:1, the first colon is, it is good to give thanks to Yahweh. The second colon is to sing praises to the Most High. Now, one thing you'll notice there, he did not repeat, it is good, at the beginning of the second colon, but we understand that that carries over. That's called a lacuna, that's a gap, but we understand that technically he's saying it is good to give thanks to Yahweh, it is good to sing praises to the Most High, but they left a blank there. And so you can see some parallels here. Here they are making give thanks parallel to sing praises. There is a difference between giving thanks and singing praises. We'll talk about that at some point, either in this section or in the next. But also it has Yahweh paralleled with the Most High. The Most High is a much more ancient way of talking about a deity than Yahweh. The Most High is a pagan term. When you have, and pagan just means polytheistic, so when you have a polytheistic system with many gods, what does it mean to be the Most High? Well, he's the king of the gods. So in what you find in the Hebrew poetry is that there is a lot more, how do I say? A poet is less careful in following the theological rules than a person who is recounting a story, telling a narrative. Does that make sense? And that's true too in English poetry. You might sing a song that is not as bound to reality, the words of the song, as as maybe you've experienced things. Songs are meant to create emotion, and sometimes they will stretch the boundaries of things. Well, we find that in the Hebrew poetry too. Most likely, well, let me not say it that way. It's something that I'm aware of. I don't know that I'm an expert enough to say most likely. Probably poetry came before the stories. I know, for example, in Judges chapter 4, we have the story of Barak and Deborah and Jael. And Jael draws Sisera into the tent and drives a tent peg through his head. And so we're told a story. Then chapter 5, that comes right after it, is a poem about Jael and Sisera. And the poem is much more fantastical, less rooted in, good hard facts that you can understand. In the chapter 4, she takes a tent peg and drives it through his temple. In chapter 5, there are 5 words used for her killing him that only appear in that chapter in the Bible. They're obscure words. They're flowery language, and they are exaggerated. To give you an example of what I'm talking about, let's say I'm playing baseball and I hit the ball. The pitcher is a fast pitcher and I hit the ball. And that's the reality. That's the story. But in the poem about it, I smack the cover off of it. I send it out to the cheap seats. We may never see that ball again. And you see the difference between a I'm trying to illustrate the difference between a poem and a thing. Now, most likely, or possibly, quite possibly, the poems came before the stories, that the stories in the Bible have been taken from poems. It's an older form of communicating in a written form, because remember, or pre-written form, because remember, before the Bible was written down, it was spoken orally. How do you remember things orally? Well, do you remember the words of a song better than you remember what somebody said 50 years ago? Can you remember lyrics from songs 50 years ago, but you can't remember what somebody said to you last week? All right, that's the ideal. So poetry was an older form of communication and recording things, and probably the stories that are in the Bible are often given. So they reach back further in some ways. Plus, there are instances, and we've seen this before in other things, where the Bible authors have borrowed something from that had been written before, not about Yahweh, maybe written about some pagan god, and they say, you know what, that expresses a lot of the ideas that I want to express about God, and they take it and they rub out, whatever, Baal Bereth or whatever, and they put Yahweh in there. Because they say that well explains, something that I want to say about God. But I find it interesting, so I highlight it to you, that a lot of the terms, you will see frequently terms about like the Most High, which is most likely a pagan term, a polytheistic term for God. Because if God is monotheism, there are not other gods for him to rule over. There may be other spiritual beings for God to rule over, angels and demons, but there are not other deities. So Most High, might stretch the idea. Anyway, enough about that. I will point out, too, in that same vein, most of the mentions of the Leviathan. There is I believe it is Psalm 72, where it talks about God, that the Leviathan is God's plaything. And that points towards the Canaanite creation myth about their god Baal fighting a battle with the sea monster Tiamat, and killing that sea monster, cutting it half in two, and making the sky with half its body and the land with half its body. And so there's a couple psalms that refer to the Leviathan. So these are things that are reaching back, but you definitely see the author's intention is to take that fantastical, we might say comic book image of a sea monster and saying he's God's plaything, And the idea might be to communicate to pagan people that Yahweh is the creator God, the uncreated creator, and it might just be poetic fancy. So anyway, let's continue. Penetrating the parallelism, getting in it. What makes a line a line? The answer is parallelism. A particular relationship exists when we have, for example, in Psalm 92:1, there's a relationship between those two cola with one another. A relationship exists between the cola. There's a certain flow of thought from one colon to the next. So the idea, Psalm 92:1, for example, it is good to give thanks to Yahweh as a statement. And then the idea in the second colon extends that. Now, giving thanks is talking about the deeds of God, something that God has done. You thank him for a deed that he has done. To sing praises is more. Whether you do something for me or not, God, you are worthy of my praise. And so that is a higher. So there is a flow of thought into the second. And then Most High can take on even greater meaning. He is the king over all reality, He is the most valuable thing in my heart. So there is a flow of thought from one colon to the next. So here's a definition of parallelism. Parallelism is the art of saying something similar in both cola, both parts of the line, but with a difference added in the second colon. This can happen in several ways. I'll give you several different examples. The first would be correspondence in grammar. So both cola have similar grammatical structure, so we can see the comparisons made. For example, Psalm 103:10. Not according to our sins has he done to us. Not according to our iniquities has he repaid upon us. And that's a good thing. That's a statement of God's mercy. In the grammar lines up. The grammar means that the words have the same function in the parts of the colons. I won't get into much. We'll see in a minute. Then syntax, get throwing a fancy word. Syntax has to do with the interrelationships of the words, how they connect to one another to give meaning. Anyway, I don't want to get too depth in that. The second would be correspondence in meaning, and in fact, Psalm 103:10 has this too. It's a correspondence in grammar and in meaning. That is the word meanings. So Psalm 92:6, only a simpleton would not know, and only a fool, with simpleton and fool being correspondence in meaning, would understand this. Know and understand being correspondence in meaning. They're basically saying the same thing in the two lines with a correspondence in the meaning. The word there, the fancy word there is semantics. Semantics has to do with word meanings, and you've heard the phrase, oh, it's a matter of semantics. And, you know, word meaning and definitions are very important in communication. And one of the things in the modern world is people like to twist and stretch word meanings to say something or to get out of saying something. I don't remember much about, I did not watch much about Bill Clinton when they were going to impeach Bill Clinton for being with Monica Lewinsky. But I do remember they asked him a question, and Bill Clinton's answer, and I find Bill Clinton to be a very slick man, not a very moral man, but a very slick man. He said, in answering the question, he said, that depends on your definition of the word is. That was his answer. They asked him a specific question. He said, it depends on how you define the word is. That's a semantic, playing semantics, playing word meanings to, in that case, manipulate things. And we see that a lot anymore, manipulating word meanings. Anyway, so that's two of the main things you'll see in the parallelism, that correspondence in grammar and correspondence in meaning. Let's go on down to seeing the word pictures. We said imagery was one of the important functions in the poetry. Perhaps the essence of poetry is painting word pictures in the imaginations. Images touch the emotions and engage the mind, and that is a function. Hebrew poetry, like English poetry, is meant to stir you, to stir a feeling in you. And a lot of the way they do that is giving you a picture of something that you can relate to. If they want happiness, they're going to give you a picture of something to make you happy. And in this way, I think it is similar to modern poetry. Images equal pictures of concrete actions or things from ordinary life. The poets are connecting with the reader through these images. So, for example, Psalm 1, verse 3, like trees planted along the riverbank, bearing fruit each season. Now, this is being compared to relationship with God. When you are praying and reading your Bible and seeking God intentionally, you're like a tree that's planted along a riverbank, bearing fruit each season. Now, for us that have grown up in the eastern United States, this is not that impactful an image. All trees, most trees bear some kind of something here. But this is written in a semi-arid place. Basically, we would consider it a desert. And the thing, when you go to the desert, you know where the water is. Everything's brown. Everything's scorched and burnt. The rocks look hot and burnt. And then all of a sudden you see a bunch of trees and palm trees and greenery in a location. You know there's water there. And so bearing that in mind, you see this world is like a desert, a spiritual desert. And a person who seeks out God is like a tree that is planted along a riverbank that is just drinking its fill every day, and then it bears fruit, and it is stable and steady and joyful and consistent and a positive and a pleasant smell in everybody's nose. And so you see it is an impactful image as you intended by the poet. So seeing these pictures, following the patterns, Hebrew poets use structural patterns in their constructing their compositions. The key for us is to find the pattern. Let me point out a couple of these patterns. The first one I don't really have an example of, but it is a linear pattern. Anything that is linear, you see the first part of that is line. So this is just a line of words that do not repeat. Units in a non-repeating order, A, B, C, D, E with no repetition. Much more, you will see parallel patterns, typically formed by two colon. We've already seen several examples. Units in the second colon parallel or match the units of the first. For example, first colon, A, B, C, the parallel colon would be A prime, B prime, C prime, as in Psalm 19:1. And there it is. The heavens proclaim the glory of God. And then in the parallel colon, the skies display his craftsmanship. Okay, and so that's a little bit redundant. That's repeating what we've already heard. Ancient people, this is an important truth here for reading the Bible. Ancient people were accustomed to repetition, but it can be bothersome to modern readers. Have you ever noticed when you try to read the Old Testament and the New Testament to a certain extent, it says things over and over and over? Well, that is because originally when these stories were told, they were remembered and spoken orally. And the way you remember stuff is by repeating it over and over. And so you need to understand that you are reading an ancient document when you read the Bible, and some of those conventions, even though they're not conventions anymore, come along. They will repeat stories, and they will tell stories in a way to point out the connections to another story, intentionally making them sound like the same story, even when they're not. And that is to point out the truths and the connections in the stories and to be able to remember them, to help him remember it. A symmetrical pattern would be you take the first line and then you flip it in the second line, adds inversion to the repetition. So ABC, then you have CBA. For example, Psalm 51:2, wash me clean from my guilt, from my sin, purify me. You see how that is flipped, inverted. let's stop there for this week, because I'm expecting that technician to come. And we will begin next week going into the book of Psalms, and talking about the purpose of the Psalms. And the purpose is instruction. That's what the word Torah means. But we'll pick up there next week. Let's stop and say a prayer and be dismissed.